Hoy. Buenos días nuevamente. ¿Se escucha? Sí. Primero que todo, pedir disculpas por la voz. ¿Sí? Los catarros no perdonan y no se curan rápidamente cuando uno tiene que hacer una presentación. Pero es verdad que este congreso de AFIN es parte de nuestra vida y tampoco, a pesar de la voz, estaba yo con ganas de perdérmelo. Así que, disculparme. Esta primera sesión de la mañana la hemos titulado Revisando la teoría del apego. Yo creo que, me voy a presentar para que sepáis quién soy. Lila Parrondo, soy psicóloga, directora del Centro de Apoyo para Familias Adoptivas Adoptantes, que queda en Madrid, en España, y además integrante del grupo AFIN. Quería, como introducción, muy breve introducción al tema del apego, ver desde dónde se llegó a que se pusiera en marcha esta construcción teórica para poder entender las situaciones, principalmente de la niñez largamente institucionalizada o en condiciones de privación afectiva. En 1945, René Spitz, un médico vienés, psiquiatra y psicoanalista, acuñó el término de hospitalismo para definir un conjunto de síntomas de deterioro que se oye mal. ¿Ahora mejor? Vale, gracias. De síntomas de deterioro que produce la deprivación afectiva, como son el retardo en el desarrollo corporal, la incapacidad de adaptación al ambiente, el mutismo, en algunos casos con situaciones similares al autismo, y que en los casos de carencia afectiva total podrían llevar al marasmo e incluso a la muerte del niño. Sus estudios se plasmaron en una película que se llamó Enfermedad psicogénica en la infancia, y a partir de 1952, en que se exhibió, se produjo un gran cambio en la comprensión del impacto que la deprivación afectiva podía producir al desarrollo infantil. Cambio que se vio reflejado en los cuidados que se le brindaron a partir de entonces a los niños ingresados en hospitales y en orfanatos. Por ejemplo, a partir de ese momento, el ingreso hospitalario, es decir, cuando un niño enfermaba y tenía que ingresar al hospital, comenzó a realizarse junto con sus mamás. Hasta ese momento los niños estaban solos en el hospital y sus madres o su familia acudía unos minutos al día a recibir el parte médico, no a hacerle compañía en ese momento tan difícil para el niño. En España, el Hospital de la Paz, que está en Madrid, fue pionero en su implementación, solo para niños de larga estancia, cardiológicos, neurológicos, y recién en 1986. Digo esto porque esto nos permite comprender qué lugar le daba la medicina, por ejemplo, el acompañamiento que los padres podían realizar de sus hijos. Más bien, parecía que estorbábamos bastante y que lo importante eran los cuidados médicos. Los estudios de etología de Konrad Lorenz en los años 50 y los experimentos de monos que todos conocemos de Harry Harlow guiaron a Bowlby en sus estudios con niños institucionalizados. La tesis fundamental es que la seguridad, la ansiedad o el temor de un niño es determinado en gran medida por la accesibilidad y capacidad de respuesta de su principal figura de apego. Aunque siempre hablamos de la madre, es cualquiera que ocupe este rol, no necesariamente la madre. Han pasado muchos años desde entonces y nuestros niños, los niños de la adopción de hoy en día, han vivido circunstancias similares a las de Andrei, un niño que fue abandonado al nacer en un país de la Europa del Este y que permaneció 3 meses en un hospital hasta que se decidió su traslado a un orfanato. Por ser un niño sin familia, pasó esos 3 primeros meses en una sala especial para niños como él. Suponemos que la atención médica debe haber sido adecuada. Pero, ¿con quién habrá establecido algún vínculo este niño? Lazos afectivos. Imaginemos que si era un niño con mucha capacidad de atraer al adulto, a lo mejor momentáneamente una enfermera o una personal de limpieza le dedicó una palabra o tal vez una sonrisa. Si imaginamos que su paso al orfanato mejoró su situación, es que ninguno de vosotros habéis conocido a la directora de esa institución. Esta señora tenía un método infalible, según decía ella, para que los niños se apegaran inmediatamente a la nueva familia. El futuro deparaba a Andrei 3 años muy especiales. Cada mes le cambiaban de cuna, cada 3 meses de habitación, por tanto de compañeros y de cuidadores, y una vez al año de pabellón. El método, muy eficaz para adquirir seguridad y confianza, seguramente estaría sustentado en la teoría de que los niños, una vez transcurrido un breve tiempo con su nueva familia, y al comprobar que para vivir en este mundo no era necesario pagar el peaje de una mudanza permanente, se aferrarían firmemente a sus papás, esperando que nada ni nadie les obligara a hacer una nueva maleta. Para Andrei, adquirir seguridad y confianza ha resultado un proceso lento, muy lento y muy dificultoso. Afortunadamente, es un niño resiliente, capaz de recuperarse frente a la adversidad, ha encontrado unos papás que le han dado un amor incondicional y que además han sabido pedir ayuda a tiempo, orientación, apoyo, y que desde ahí están pudiendo salir de la dificultad. Solo estas líneas para plantear el tema, y ahora os dejo en compañía de Jenny Bristow. Jenny es doctoranda en el Center for Parenting Culture Studies de la Universidad de Kent, en Reino Unido, y entre otras muchas cosas es autora de un libro que se llama Standing Up to Super Nanny, que hemos traducido por Rebelándose contra la Super Nanny. Jenny, when you want to.
Which is it? Return. Which to go to the next one?
Next, back.
Next and back, okay. Thank you. At the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies, we research into parenting in general across the board, so policies that seek to affect and regulate parents, pregnancy and other issues to do with looked after children. And to begin with, I wanted to indicate that in the UK it's very clear that attachment theory is everywhere. It informs a very big part of policy surrounding childbirth, where there's a great deal of emphasis on breastfeeding a newborn baby and bonding with a new baby. A lot of emphasis on what is called the skin-to-skin contact that a mother has with her neonate, and this is seen as highly important. In childcare, despite the fact that there has been an increase and a normalisation of maternal employment, there's still a great deal of anxiety about daycare, nursery care for very young children, and an attempt to bring the attachment discourse into discussions about how nursery care is organised. In relation to pregnancy, one concept that I have recently become quite aware of, and I think is very interesting, is the discussion about prenatal attachment, or, to put it another way, maternal-fetal bonding. So you have this kind of idea of the attachment and bonding discourse being brought into discussions about how women feel about their pregnancy, not even the baby that exists. And linked to that, recently, it's been made very explicit that parenting policy now sees the period of -9 to 24 months as crucial. -9 meaning when a woman is first pregnant with her child, that's when intervention should begin, that's when policymakers should be very concerned about issues such as attachment and bonding. So it's a very widespread discourse and set of ideas, but I think the discussion around attachment and its flip side, which is mother-child bonding, I think contains within it quite a strong policy contradiction. And this is a discourse that promotes very heavily the proximity of the mother and child. It's about the promotion of closeness and intimacy. And yet, the way that it does that introduces an agenda of monitoring, of surveillance and intervention into that intimate relationship between mother and child by a third party. And it's this policy contradiction that I wanted to explore today. I think it's interesting when we look at how we might account for the contradiction within the attachment discourse. Because I think if you look at the history of this discourse, really since the end of the Second World War, you can see that it has the character of a constantly shifting pseudoscience. I'll go on to explain that in a minute. But it's a discourse that appears to be very scientific, but in fact its meaning has been redefined according to wider cultural and political anxieties and agendas. So to begin with, we had Bowlby's thesis of maternal deprivation, which, I've got a quote up here, but this is based on concerns about children in wartime orphanages completely deprived of contact with an adult caregiver. And this became the influential theory that everyone referred to. And what Bowlby was concerned about was maternal deprivation, the absence of a mother figure or a constant caregiver for infants reared in very, very extreme conditions. Bowlby's critique, as we know, was of institutional care. It was about the absence of a mother. And this, I think, can be seen as distinct from Bowlbyism, which is quite widely recognised as an ideology. Bowlbyism is not just Bowlby's theory, but it was an ideology that arose to popularise Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. And this arose really as a response to the instability of the post-war period and the desire to bolster the nuclear family. So this, if we recall, was a period where women had gone out to work in the war and where daycare had been introduced by necessity, and then the men came home from the war, and there was a concerted cultural effort to promote the ideal of a woman staying at home, being what we call in Anglo-American the housewife, taking care for her family. And Bowlbyism is very much kind of recognised as part of that agenda, a desire to get women out of work and into the home. I think that the point made by Marianne Kaniewski is important here, though, that, as she says, when Bowlby was writing, and even the discourse of Bowlbyism, that talked about maternal deprivation, the absence of the mother. Kaniewski says, at this point, the quality of parenting has not come into question yet. More emphasis on the quality of parenting happened around the end of the 1960s with the development of Mary Ainsworth's strange situation test, which was a test that she devised to classify the extent to which children seem to be securely or less securely attached to their mother. And this was quite interesting because, again, to cite Kaniewski, as she says, by the development of this test and the focus on how young children responded to their mother, the quality of mothering could then be measured. So you could measure whether a mother was, or a child, was securely attached or insecurely attached. And an insecurely attached child was seen to have a whole range of negative outcomes. And as Kaniewski says, the meaning of maternal deprivation thus shifted from indicating the absence of a mother to indicating mothering inadequacy. And I think this whole notion of mothering inadequacy is what I want to go on to explore. I'm referring here to a book, I think it's an absolute superb critique by Diane Ayer, who's an American academic, called Maternal Infant Bonding, a Scientific Fiction. And this is a pretty comprehensive look at the way in which bonding theory developed and the kind of peaks and troughs, if you like, of its popularity, the rise and fall of bonding theory, and the reasons why it may have become popular at particular times. And, as she kind of explains, theories of bonding, concern about the quality of the mother-child attachment relationship, developed through animal studies, and this is what really became the kind of the science of bonding, if you like. Studies of rhesus monkeys and the like, which kind of purported to show that what happened in nature, this is what happened in nature, and so this is what should happen in human society. Now, these studies developed in the 70s were fairly comprehensively discredited by later scientific and sociological studies. A quote here from William Ray Arney, who makes the point that much of the research on bonding is methodologically flawed, and this was the way that it was discredited. The studies could not be replicated. Yet, despite the scientific questions raised over bonding theory, it has been accepted uncritically, nonetheless. So how do we account for the persistence of the appeal of this theory, which has been shown not to be a science that can be proven, but a pseudoscience, something that looks like a science, but actually isn't? I want to suggest that the ongoing appeal of bonding and attachment theory relates to three cultural and political trends. And I'm going to deal with those more briefly than they deserve, but just to kind of raise a few questions. The three trends are scientisation, moralisation, and institutional reorganisation. The reorganisation of institutions which make use of these kind of ideas. So scientisation, again, we're back to the discussion of bonding theory as a pseudoscience. And I think this is kind of very interesting because, as with many scientific discourses within parenting culture now, the problem with scientisation is that it's very exclusive and elitist, in the sense that if you have people saying the science shows, for example, why mothers should stay at home with their children, or why mothers should behave like this towards their infants, then it excludes criticism from people who aren't scientists. And Stuart will talk more about that in relation to the current discussion about neuroscience. But I think scientisation is a very kind of important part of it. People are blinded by science, and they think that when the scientists are said to have said this, then there's no room for debate. Moralisation, again, William Ray Arney makes this point quite nicely, that bonding theory is kind of actively prejudiced against a particular kind of woman. If you're going to emphasise the importance of maternal-child proximity, particularly in the early years of life, and you are going to talk about the particular kind of parenting and a particular kind of interaction, that is contradictory to any idea that women should, for example, be leaving their children in childcare and going out to work, or pursuing a life of their own rather than focusing completely on the maternal-child relationship. So, as he says, bonding theory quickly finds roots in commonsensical notions about the social order. You have scientific claims that are made which take off largely because they back up what certain sections of the cultural and political elites think about the way in which families should be formed and managed. And then finally, institutional reorganisation. I have a couple of quotes on this, one from Aya and one from Arnie. Both make essentially the same point, which is that part of the reason for the popularity of bonding theory in the 1970s was that it coincided with other shifts that were going on. An important one of those shifts was the crisis of obstetric care, hospital births, that was going on at that time. And essentially what you had was the rise of the natural birth movement, which emphasised bonding as being a very important reason why women should not be sort of have their labours managed actively and be separated from their children, from their infants after birth, in the way that used to happen certainly in British hospitals, where children were taken to the nurseries and mothers were left to sleep. I mean, so there was this kind of idea that actually mothers and infants needed to be together all the time. And this coincided with a kind of wider crisis in childbirth. And the whole idea of bonding, as Aya says, provided the rationale for making the hospital more like home, appearing to give parents the best of both worlds. Another quote here from Arnie. So what you have is a situation, as you have today, where most, 98% of births happen in hospital, and yet the emphasis is from the moment of labour is on keeping the infant with the child next to the bed, promoting breastfeeding, skin-to-skin contact, and quite aggressively monitoring the bonding relationship. Bonding theory, says Arnie, made falling in love simply another phase in the pregnancy-birth process. An important point, because there he's indicating the extent to which this emotional, intense, intimate relationship was seen as something to be managed by professionals. So this is how we arrive at what I call the attachment paradox, which is a paradox whereby a natural, emotional relationship, falling in love with one's infant and vice versa, comes to be seen as something that is and should be artificially engineered. Experts come to play a role in the governance of intimate feelings by, for example, looking to determine the quality of the attachment relationship between the mother and the infant. And the proximity of the maternal-infant dyad is situated as something that is very crucial. So mothers and babies have to stay together all the time, but it's also opened up increasingly to intervention through the notion that experts should play a role in checking that the bonding process is all happening as it should, according to what it says in the books. As I indicated at the beginning, the theory changes and comes around according to whatever other issues are on the agenda at the moment. I want to highlight two here. Breastfeeding promotion, the aggressive promotion of breastfeeding, has been a very big issue in UK policy, particularly over the past 10 years. And this, as those writers show, is also a highly scientised and moralised claim. But the notion that it's very important that children should be, well, it's crucial that children should be breastfed from birth, kind of falls in with this notion that it's very important that mothers and children are together all the time and they bond. Prenatal attachment, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think this is very interesting because I think it does feed into what in the UK is often called the responsibilisation agenda. That basically means that women who embark on motherhood, i.e. who become pregnant, adopt a particular standard forms of behaviours and attitudes about their pregnancy. The idea being that if you care about your fetus, you will eat the right things, behave in the right way, and that you have this kind of the right kind of emotional response to your pregnancy. I think that's very problematic. I don't have time to go into that now. I think the impetus behind the use of bonding theory is the attempt to manage uncertainty through the regulation of maternal behaviour. As I imagine people here know, I mean, this is not a new theme. I mean, maternal behaviour has always been regulated, and there's an attempt to manage the fact that we don't know a lot of outcomes for babies by really focusing on making sure that women have the right, in inverted commas, right feelings about their babies, and to develop ideas around parenting around the ideal rather than the actual child, which has become a very important part of parenting discourse in recent years. There's the notion that the issue is not about you, the person, this child there, and you have a relationship together, but about the kind of child that you want to, that they should be. They should be the right weight, they should have the right kind of physical characteristics, and there's this kind of notion that there is an ideal child that you can create if only you behave according to particular ideas in your pregnancy and in the early years of birth. So just to conclude with some questions and problems. I think, as I said at the beginning, scientisation excludes debate about ideology. I think that's deeply problematic for people who want to have a critical dialogue about these issues. I think the intervention of experts into the mother-child relationship creates a distance between the mother and the child, which is interesting, very contradictory to what bonding appears to be on the surface, because it actually fragments that intense relationship rather than supports it. And with the notion of prenatal bonding, this is just a question really. I think there is this, and the policy agenda of -9, that begins at -9 months. I do think we have some worrying trends emerging in relation to some kind of form of fetal personhood, and some kind of notion that the pregnancy should be seen as a person in its own right from the moment of conception, which is certainly not the case in Britain in the discourse about abortion and fertility control. But I think in relation to pregnancy culture, there's that trend emerging. So thank you very much for listening to me. These are the references.
Muchísimas gracias, Jenny. Además, ajustadísima en tiempo, vamos, impresionante. Ahora tenemos con nosotros a Stuart Derbyshire. Él es doctor en psicología por la Universidad de Birmingham, en el Reino Unido, y su tesis doctoral ha versado sobre imágenes cerebrales. ¿Sí? Stuart, when you want.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation to this lovely city that I still can't pronounce the name of. It's down at the bottom. It's already open. Okay, so I'm going to follow on from Jenny, and I'm going to talk about the problem of infant neurodeterminism. As Jenny mentioned, there's been an increasing scientization of parenting, and neuroscience has played a particular role in that. I start with this slide for a couple of reasons. One, because it's just kind of amusing, but also because it illustrates a nice point, which is that we've had parenting science for quite a while. It's been around for at least 50 years, if not several hundred years. And as we look back, we can see that past parenting science had some problems associated with it. To modernize, the idea that you should feed your child 7-Up as early as possible is considered rather odd, if not completely immoral. Similarly for Coca-Cola. As we look back, we can see very clearly that this is not a sensible suggestion. But it was harder at the time to see this is not a sensible suggestion. And the history that's right in front of us, the science that's right in front of us, is often very difficult to critique. It's often very difficult to see what is wrong with it. There have been, in the modern day, a slew of reports using neuroscience to justify a wide variety of suggestions about how we should and shouldn't parent. In the UK, it's now widely considered that if you don't parent properly in the first 3 to 5 years, then your children will grow up to be all kinds of problems. And it's widely touted by British politicians that if we get parenting right, we can solve problems of poverty, we can solve problems of child attainment, we can solve pretty much every social, moral and political problem that we face. Given how important this is, and these reports are united by the idea that there's the first 3 or 5 years are vital. What happens in these early years is somehow written into the brain, and if you get it wrong, the child will lack empathy, lack the capacity to learn, and this will usher in crime and poverty, as I say. There's this idea that if we can get the first 3 to 5 years right, we'll solve all major problems that we face. Consequently, it's argued that educating parents about the early years is absolutely vital. It's necessary for the public good to do this. Parents are going to need training to address the early year needs of their infants, and what is required, in short, is summarized in this pamphlet, Parenting Matters, is a significant societal attitude shift akin to those involving seatbelt wearing and drink driving, towards recognizing that parenting is something that has a societal aspect and importance, about which it is socially acceptable for people to seek advice, learn, and improve. In other words, we need to change the moral environment such that it's not wrong to ask for parenting advice. In fact, it's positively good, and if you don't ask for advice, you're doing something wrong. Training should be seen to be a good thing, just as putting on your seatbelt is a good thing when you get into a car, not drinking and driving, and so on. So what is the science that supports these kinds of policy beliefs and these policy suggestions? Well, the science can be broken into two major groups, studies of severely abused infants and studies of animals chronically deprived of sensory input. So let's look at the first group, studies of severely deprived infants. There have been a number of reports coming out largely from the experiences of the Romanian orphanages in Romania. Children brought up in fairly hostile conditions, horrific conditions, have been studied as they've been adopted into Western families. And this is an example of one of those studies. This is a group of children, their brains, the mean age 9 years when the scan was done. All of them were placed into a Romanian orphanage by 6 weeks of age. They stayed there for a mean duration of 38 months before they were adopted out into Western families. And their brain function is being compared with a group of non-institutionalized infants. You don't have to be an expert in neuroscience to understand what's going on here. You can see these little red areas. These red areas are showing the areas of reduced activity in the brain in the institutionalized infants. And this reduced activity is in and around the hippocampal formation. The hippocampus is considered to be vital for memory function and also for some emotional functions associated with anxiety. And so there's reduced activity in that part of the brain in children that were institutionalized from a young age. As well as brain function, there's been a number of studies looking at brain connectivity. It's a slightly different technique, looking at how the brain is wired up physically rather than how it's just functioning. Again, you're looking at a severely deprived child. This is a child that came out of one of the Romanian orphanages versus a normal child. And what you're looking at is the white matter tract from the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex. And you can see that on the crikey, so at the right-hand side, yes, I think it's the right-hand side, things look fairly similar between the two children, but on the left-hand side, there's a withering away of the connection in the severely deprived child. So you have reduced functional capacity in the hippocampus, reduced connectivity between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex in these severely deprived children. And the implication of that is that you're going to have some problems with cognition, some problems with the behavioral abilities in these children. And again, a number of studies have demonstrated this is, in general, the case. This is the same children, 9 years, placed into an orphanage for a mean duration of 29 months before adoption. Normal children will average 100 on all of these measures of cognition and behavior. And you can see that the adopted kids, on average, all average below 100 on each of these. Only impulsivity comes out as being significantly different from the normal population, but I don't want to focus too much on that. There is evidence here of global cognitive and behavioral problems. Across the spectrum, these kids have problems. So just to summarize, basically what this research has demonstrated that infants placed in a severely deprived environment, mostly Romanian orphanages for the first 3 years of life, have changes in brain connectivity and function, reduced cognitive ability, and increased behavioral problems at age 9. And that seems a fairly solid base of research. The second area of research that's used to justify early parental intervention is with animal studies. Mostly kittens have been deprived of visual input. These are classic studies from Hubel and Wiesel in the 1960s and 70s. And what Hubel and Wiesel demonstrated was that if you look at the representation of the eyes, the cells that represent the eyes in the back of the brain for normal kittens, you see a distribution something like this. These are the cells representing this eye, these are the cells representing this eye, and the ones in the middle represent both eyes. If you sew up the kitten's right eye for the first 3 months of life, what you then find at 38 months is that the cell representation is profoundly shifted. There are now no cells representing this eye, no cells representing both eyes, and lots of cells representing the eye that wasn't sewn shut. If you sew the eye shut later in life, from 12 months to 38 months, and then look at the cell distribution, what you see is there's a reduction in number of cells overall, but the distribution remains similar to the normal situation. So this gave rise to two ideas. One is that essentially you need sensory input for the brain to develop appropriately. You need appropriate sensory input for the brain to develop appropriately. And it also demonstrated that that appropriate input has to be within a critical time frame. If you don't get it during the first 3 months, you have a profound problem. If you do get it for the first 12 months, the problem is reduced. Okay, so that's the science base of this, and I want to start now to critique the science base of this as it relates to the normal situation. And I think one of the things that, as my neuroscientific colleagues do, that is inappropriate is they extrapolate from these quite severe cases to the normal situation, and that extrapolation is simply unwarranted. Typical families do not isolate their children for 23 plus hours a day and do not sew up their children's eyelids. I know it's a fairly obvious thing to say, but the kids in the Romanian orphanages were in absolutely dire situations. They were isolated physically and mentally for long, long periods. As I say, over 23 hours a day, locked in their crib was not an unusual situation. They were also malnourished, they were also cold, they were also not receiving appropriate medical treatment. These are not the kinds of things that typical families do. And what the literature on neuroscience in early infancy does is it plays a trick on us. It will elide this rather severe situation with the normal situation. And this can happen in all kinds of different ways. My favorite example of this comes from Bruce Perry. In his paper, he writes about the overt childhood abuse situation. He writes about kids raised in orphanages. And then he says this: recent inadvertent impacts of technology have spawned declines in extended families, family meals, and spontaneous peer interactions. And so what he's done there is he's drawn a line now between being locked in a crib for 23 hours a day to missing a family meal. And that elision between the abnormal and the normal, I think, is unwarranted. Being caged in a crib all day is not the same as missing a family meal. It's not the same as being ignored. It's not the same as being neglected. And we can see that this situation is profoundly different from this situation. And I cannot understand any of my colleagues who can't observe that the differences there are immense. And as it happens, this very, very famous image of a normal child and a child who's gone through this experience, it does show that the brain is profoundly smaller in this child. But as I've mentioned, these kids are not just mentally isolated, they are physically abused too. They lack food, they lack fluid, they lack warmth, they lack medical care. No matter how much emotional and cognitive input you put into these children, their brain will still look like this as a consequence of the malnourishment and nothing at all to do with the lack of cognitive and emotional input. Now, it's very difficult to assess just how much interaction is good enough, because generally speaking, we don't do controlled trials where we manipulate the amount of interaction that parents have with their children. But there have been some natural experiments that have addressed this. So one natural experiment is involving delayed response tasks, which measures representational memory. Representational memory is basically what it says on the tin. It's the ability to hold in memory something for a period of time. In the classic experiment, you'll have an infant sat here, 2 cups in front of the infant. You show the infant something interesting, then you hide it under one of the cups, hide the cups for a period of time, reveal the cups, and if the infant knocks over the cup with the interesting item more often than chance, then you can judge that the infant remembers where it was. Between 0 and 3 months, kids can't do this at all. They have no memory trace, apparently, enable them to do this. From 3 months on, you can hide the cups for a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then increasingly for longer time periods. Generally speaking, this ability is dependent upon the development of the prefrontal cortex, so it involves neural activity. But critically here, what Anne Diamond and Goldman Krish demonstrated is that through repeat testing, you don't particularly get much of a bump. So they tested lots and lots of kids repeatedly over the first year of life. And at the end of that 12 months, they had a little bit of a bump. They could hide the objects for a few seconds longer than in kids that hadn't been repeat tested. But that advantage disappeared after the first year of life, did not result in any significant long-term gains. And what they basically argued is that memory develops at approximately the same rate, regardless of any enrichment. Similarly, with language, it's been demonstrated by Patricia Kuhl that newborns can discriminate all the sounds found in human languages, so we can break sounds down into phonemes, and those phonemes have different uses in different languages. In Asian languages, for example, L and R sound basically the same. There's no discrimination between L and R, which is why Asian speakers struggle with hello. They tend to say hello in English, that kind of thing. By 10 months, Patricia Kuhl has demonstrated that infants will more readily respond to the phonemes that are particular to their language. And she's demonstrated that this is what's necessary for this is that you talk to your infants. That's not particularly surprising. But how much talking, well, nobody knows for sure, but she's guessing around 1 to 2 hours is enough. And there's no evidence that flashcards at 3 months or any other types of enrichment provide any advantage. So just to summarize this, severe deprivation causes problems. That's maybe not surprising. Normal family interactions are simply not comparable, and as far as we can tell, normal interactions are good enough to produce normal functioning infants and normal brains. But also I would say that even deprivation, severe deprivation, can be overcome. So in the adopted infants, at adoption, 70 to 90% of them have a global impairment in their cognitive abilities. But a few years after adoption, that figure drops from 14 to between 14 and 36%. So considerable gains can be made even long after the period of deprivation. I'm not pretending it's a picnic. I do know severe problems continue, but dramatic improvements have been recorded in this population. In fact, it's been demonstrated in separate research that parents might not even matter that much. Jill Harris has demonstrated in a review that the children of deaf parents will learn how to speak as well as those whose parents speak to them from day one. The children of immigrants learn the local language and almost never retain the accent of their parents. And parental variability in personality types, from anxious to carefree, lots of reading to almost none, permissive to authoritarian, and so on and so forth, is not a useful guide, as it happens, for how a child will turn out. So what we have here is not a use of science by the policymakers, but really an abuse of the science. Children who grow up relatively deprived, with little access to books and poor schooling, are not in any way comparable to Romanian orphanages or to animals that are completely denied sensory input. And to draw that comparison is fallacious. The typical inadequacies of early years can be addressed later in life. If the kids coming out of Romanian orphanages can make great strides in what they're able to do, there's no reason to think that children that miss out on a family meal can't do well in later life. So the descent into antisocial behavior, crime, educational failure, poverty, and so on and so forth cannot be blamed on irreparable brain damage that's caused in the early years through parental neglect. And I do think, just to finish, that there are some rather unpleasant negative effects of all this parental advice that's given out to people. We're already thrown more and more onto our own resources, feeling as though everything that we do with our kids has profound consequences and that we are on our own. And this advice to read to your child for a certain number of hours a day, to not show them too much television and all the rest of it that you're told, further isolates parents and further estranges them from their own instincts. And so there's a real disruption of normal family life. Maybe what's in the guides doesn't work for you, but you're forced to basically abide by it, whether it works for you or not. And parents are increasingly not able to trust their own instincts about what's good for them. It also, I think, undermines personal adult responsibility. If you end up in crime, or if you end up doing something wrong in your older adulthood, you can blame that on the fact that you weren't looked after properly from 0 to 5. All your negative behavior is down to decisions that were made on your behalf before your 5th birthday, and I think that's an unreasonable message to deliver to people. And as Jenny has already spoken about, it also invites a certain authoritarian intervention into family life. So in conclusion, severe deprivation has negative consequences, but that doesn't provide any information about typical development. As far as we can tell, typical development in real normal families is good enough to produce children with normal brains and normal behavior. Science, I would argue, can't guide parenting, partly because the science is not good enough, partly because the science is probably wrong, but also because parenting is not a scientific project. The attempts to guide parenting, I would argue, are a somewhat authoritarian effort to impose unwarranted parenting practices onto people who don't need them. And finally, thank you for your attention.